Hello, hello, GM. This is Overpriced JPEGs. I am Carly Riley. I hope you are all having a wonderful start to your weekend. If you are listening to this on Saturday morning when it drops, I hope you all had a beautiful past week. I want to get right into the show. We are talking about how Meebits DAO is doing something very interesting with fractionalized ownership. We're going to talk about some of the new projects that launched this week, one in particular that I think is interesting. We're talking about Wolfgame, finally. What are my thoughts on Wolfgame? What can we learn from Wolfgame? What can we expect from Wolfgame? Is it worth all the money that was thrown into it? And then finally, the Sandbox launched their alpha this week. That's a big deal. We'll talk about that.
ZERION is the perfect place to view the entirety of your crypto portfolio all in one spot. Not only does ZERION aggregate all the tokens across all of your wallets, but it also displays the NFTs that you've been tirelessly collecting. ZERION even reports the value of your NFTs in your overall portfolio, giving you the most comprehensive report on the entirety of your crypto portfolio. ZERION isn't just a place to get an understanding of your portfolio, but it also hooks into DeFi activities like trading, borrowing, and lending, all in one convenient place. So you don't have to memorize all the various DeFi websites to do all of your DeFi activities. To get started, go to ZERION.io/Bankless and load up your wallet or wallets into the ZERION interface and supercharge your DeFi experience and enrich your NFT lifestyle. That's ZERION/Bankless.
I want to give a special thanks to overpriced JPEG partner BlockBlock. Not only because they are a sponsor of this show, but also because they are my employer. BlockBlock is an innovative blockchain lab. We work across NFTs and the metaverse, and our goal is really to push the industry forward with every new project we take on. We founded and currently run the Meebits DAO, which just partnered with Larva Labs to create more metaverse-friendly renderings of Meebits, which is awesome. We are also partnered with a Sundance Award-winning filmmaker to build the first DAO that will own a feature-length documentary film. We have a ton of cool projects down the pipeline and are really looking for cool people to partner with on this. So go to blockblock.io to subscribe to our newsletter and be kept up to date about what we have going on, and also to check out open roles we have available. Would love to have you apply. Come work with me, coming out, blockblock.io. Okay, new drops. Some of the new drops this week. Two that I just want to mention somewhat quickly because I think it's worth knowing about them. Sartoshi, who's a very famous digital artist in this space and influencer in the space in general, dropped his MFers project. It was popular all over Twitter. If you're on NFT Twitter, which if you're listening to this, you probably are, that means you probably saw the MFers. The thing that I think is fun about this project is really that it's giving me flashbacks to what it was like 2 months ago when you had these really crazed, hyped PFP type projects that would drop and there were all these crazy gas wars. Not that I think that was the best time for the NFT space, but it was a moment in the NFT space, and we haven't really had a project that captured the imagination of sort of all of NFT Twitter at once, and the Sartoshi drop, the MFers drop, seemed to do that. So check that out. Damien Hirst also on Thanksgiving airdropped all of his, like, the currency holders another NFT. It's a play on, or it's sort of in connection to the album cover he had designed for Drake at one point. So it's Damien Hirst. Everything he does, like, turns to money. He is, fun fact, I did not know this, Damien Hirst is supposedly the richest British artist in living time or whatever. He's worth like $300 million or something crazy. So I thought that was actually quite interesting. But the new drop that I actually really wanted to highlight is Ross Ulbricht has launched an NFT project from prison. So I don't know, I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with Ross Ulbricht, though I'm guessing that there are a fair number of you who are not. So I want to give a little context here, and that context will explain why I think this is so interesting. Ross Ulbricht founded something called the Silk Road, a website called the Silk Road, when he was 26 years old. The Silk Road is really the website people think of when they think of the dark web. It started off as a site where you could buy essentially any kind of drugs, and it evolved into really a marketplace for illegal goods in general. I do think the Silk Road is one of the reasons that lawmakers and people in general think of crypto as, and think of Bitcoin as really only being used for nefarious purposes. The Silk Road launched at a time when Bitcoin was really becoming popular, the first wave of Bitcoin's popularity, and it definitely accelerated, the Silk Road accelerated the adoption of Bitcoin. There are a lot of people who first got into crypto because of the Silk Road and because of Ross Ulbricht and specifically buying drugs. You know, a lot of the drug transactions that were happening on the Silk Road were marijuana, but there were also plenty of other drugs being sold. And then things did get really dark with the Silk Road. Human body parts started being sold on there, et cetera, et cetera. So Ross Ulbricht was put in jail for being the founder of the Silk Road. What's notable is he's received 2 life sentences plus 40 years. That was his sentence. Was like, you know, it's symbolic. Obviously, you're not going to live 2 lives, right? So, but like until you die, and then until you die again, and then plus an additional 40 years. And this is sort of a topic of a lot of conversation in like incarceration circles and in the crypto space in general, because people feel like that was just way too excessive for what Ross is guilty of. Notably, Ross's sentence is longer than El Chapo's sentence, despite the fact that Ross was not actually convicted of anything violent himself. So the last thing I'll say here, and I'm just highlighting this because I think Ross's story is really interesting and it's worth learning more about, and he just dropped an NFT, which is quite interesting. Ross is a libertarian who started the Silk Road because he believed in free markets. But, and this is where it's important, Ross's philosophy was predicated on nonviolence. So there were rules on the Silk Road. You weren't allowed to sell child pornography on the Silk Road because inevitably child pornography means there was violence. You violated a child. So there were rules to the Silk Road contrary to popular belief. And there is a feeling among some people, including his mother, who recently went on a Twitter space with Oh Shiny, which is why some of this is coming up again. There's a feeling that Ross was really convicted for his like libertarian ideology. The judge seemed to think that he poses a continuing threat to society and therefore made his sentence very long because she felt he still identified as a libertarian and that it was those libertarian beliefs that had led to the Silk Road, and therefore that if he continued to hold those libertarian beliefs, if he were allowed to be set free, who knows what else he would create, because it was like his libertarian ideology that led to this sort of dangerous site being started. And of course, there are a lot of people who feel very, very uncomfortable with the idea that that's sort of forming the basis for his very long sentence. This is a little bit of a digression. Hopefully it's still interesting to folks. The NFT right now is, this is Friday, the day before this podcast will air. It's got a bid of 260 ETH on it right now, one of his NFTs. So it's launched on Super Rare. It's going to go for a lot of money. And the funds, the proceeds from this NFT sale will go to support Ross's continuing legal battle. Ross is still hoping that he'll get out of prison at some point, as well as go to a nonprofit that he and his mother have started called Art for Giving, which goes to support the families of incarcerated people. So, little story about Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road, and worth checking more into if you know nothing about it. Okay, the project I want to highlight this week is Meebits. You're probably familiar with Meebits. It was the 3rd project out of Larva Labs, who launched CryptoPunks. So they're not exactly an understated project, because nothing that Larva Labs does is understated, but they did see a modest boost in floor price this week, and I actually think it's because of Meebits DAO, which is a project I'm heavily involved in. The startup that I work for was co-founded by Kai Turner, who's also the co-founder of Meebits DAO. So I work very closely with him. I work closely on a number of projects on Meebits as part of Meebits DAO. So I wanted to talk about some of what we're doing, not to shill the project at all, but because I actually think there's a lot to be learned here. And so as we look at Meebits and why they're doing that well this week, I want to highlight what we're up to, and I think there'll be some learnings as a result of that. So some context here. Larva Labs launched Meebits in, I think it was May of this year, at some point here in 2021, and they were airdropped to all CryptoPunk holders. And the premise was these would be avatars for the metaverse. So Meebits, as you probably are familiar, are 3D avatars. If you have a Meebit, you can go onto the Larva Labs website and download like the Vox files, the 3D files for your Meebit. And this was clearly Larva Labs putting a stake in the ground saying, hey, these are metaverse avatars. But there's a huge gap between making an NFT and saying, hey, this is a metaverse avatar, and then actually having that avatar be a dominant avatar in the metaverse, right? There's some distance between those two realities. And so Meebits DAO, which was started by Kai Turner, is an attempt to bridge the gap and close the gap, I guess, between where Meebits are today and where we ultimately want to see them, which is as avatars in the metaverse. And so in that way, it really acts as an investment fund, investing in projects that help to get Meebits everywhere, you could say. So one of the goals we've had with Meebits DAO for a while, and Kai in particular is really passionate about, is expanding access to ownership of Meebits. Meebits were free to CryptoPunk holders, but of course, at this point to be a CryptoPunk holder, you have to be very, very rich. And as soon as Meebits hit the secondary market, they were around 2.5 ETH. So really quite expensive for many people who would love to own Meebits, but just truly can't afford a $10,000 asset like that without really being clear on what'll happen to the price. And so we wanted to allow for just greater participation in the Meebits ecosystem. And probably a couple months ago, Kai and myself started engaging with a company called Seasons. I'll talk about that in a minute. And basically what we've put together is, it's called an album of Meebits, from the founders of Meebits DAO and Kai himself and Block, the startup I work at. We pulled together about 20 Meebits and put it in this Seasons album. And we then sold tokens, MBBT tokens, that are sort of fractions of this Meebit album. You'll see why I'm stumbling over what I'm saying here in just a minute. So in theory, this is sort of a fractionalization mechanism like those that you may be familiar with. Pranksy quite famously sold a CryptoPunk and fractionalized the CryptoPunk, and that allowed people ways to buy into the value of a CryptoPunk at a much more affordable rate. But the difference between other fractionalization platforms, where all you're doing is sort of buying a chunk of the economic value of the thing, what we've done here with our Meebits Season album is you're actually buying a proxy ownership token, which means you actually have ownership rights over the Meebits that are in this album. So what I'm saying there is, unlike if you just buy a fraction of a CryptoPunk, if you buy a fraction of a CryptoPunk and the CryptoPunk then sells for double the price, you'll double your money, and that's great. And that's an investment strategy, and good on you. But you can't use that CryptoPunk as if it's your own punk. What we're trying to do with this Meebits album is actually allow you to own a collection of Meebits that you share the ownership with others, of course. But now you can actually use one of the Meebits in that pool in the metaverse as your avatar if you so chose. You can participate in, we have a photo booth app that we're building out where you put your Meebit in the photo booth and you can take pictures of it in different poses. You can now use the Meebits that are in this pool, assuming you have enough MBBT tokens, and treat that Meebit sort of like it's your own, because it is. And that's a really perhaps nuanced distinction, but I think an important one. And in this space in general, I think especially new people, don't necessarily think enough about the nuance of what they're buying. What do you really own? What can you really do with that thing you own? I mean, on the one hand, we talk about that a ton in this space because you have the Creative Commons, and we talk about, licensing rights, and that is a big conversation in NFTs. And then on the other hand, I think individual investors don't think enough about it when they buy into a project. But your future value is very predicated on what exactly you own and what rights you have with that thing. So I do think this is something novel. I'm sure others have done something similar. We're not completely trailblazing here, but it's an example of a pretty prominent project, something like Meebits, now really broadening its access. And it's because of Meebits DAO, it's because of Kai Turner. And I watched how thoughtful Kai was through the process of creating this album and issuing these MBBT tokens and thinking about the tokenomics behind it. And so I've been really glad to see that it's really worked out. And that's the final piece I want to talk about this, which are a couple of my takeaways having watched and been a part of this process with Meebits and Meebits DAO and the MBBT tokens. So we launched this album and the sale of the album a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago at this point. And we were not expecting the MBBT tokens, which are your buy-in to own these Meebits. We were not expecting them to sell out at all. We were like, great, this will be a slow burn kind of a thing. We even ran a promotion where if you bought a general membership token to be a part of Meebits DAO, you could get some MBBT. We wanted this to be something that over time offered people a way to buy into Meebits in a way that they previously couldn't, a way to get more involved in Meebits DAO. But we weren't expecting for this to like strike fire immediately. But very quickly, I think partly because of the promotion with Meebits DAO general membership, but also for reasons that aren't entirely clear to us, the MBBT tokens took off, and specifically seemingly in Asia. What we're starting to learn is that apparently there was a lot of appetite for owning Meebits in a number of Asian countries, I think China in particular, but the price point was sort of prohibitive for folks. So there was this huge influx of investors in general and Asian investors in particular who bought up a ton of MBBT and bought all of the MBBT that was outstanding, and then drove the price of MBBT from its initial offering price of around $22, it was like 0.005 ETH, all the way up to $90 per MBBT on like CoinGecko and these liquidity, like other markets. So I want to say a couple things on this, which is, first, it felt like a study in if you build it, they will come. Kai is a really generous person in this space who, as I mentioned, was incredibly thoughtful about why he was doing this, how he laid it out. And even though he wasn't expecting a ton to come from it, at least initially, a lot did come from it. It beat his expectations because this is corny, but I think he put the right intentions out there in the world. And this is an industry and a space where sometimes things just catch fire. So this is to say, if you've been thinking about a project you want to do or playing around or an experiment you want to try and you have good intentions with the thing, just do it, right? Who cares? You know, it may not work at all, but then on the other hand, it may catch fire. So that was really fun for me to watch how this thing that we had fairly low expectations for took off. On the other hand, when the price of the MBBT hit like $90, we were all like, no, stop. I won't make the joke that Kai has made, but we were like, this is not a shitcoin. Like, we're not trying to like pump this thing. And this is me making an anti-shill for this project I'm a part of, which is like, don't go buy the price of this thing way up. And to give you the numbers, there are currently 20 or so Meebits in this season's album. Some of them are very high value Meebits. They're not all floor Meebits. And with the remaining, or with the MBBT that we've accrued now, or the ETH we've accrued from selling the MBBT, we're going to buy up many, many more Meebits for this overall album and this overall pool. There are 100,000 outstanding MBBT. So when they were each valued at $90 per MBBT, the overall valuation given to this album of Meebits was $9 million. That is too high. Meebits may end up going crazy and being worth a ton of money, and maybe $9 million won't someday be a crazy high valuation for Meebits, but right now that's a crazy high valuation for Meebits. And the people who were paying $80, $90 for this MBBT, I do not think were properly evaluating what they were buying into. This is a very straightforward transaction. You're basically getting access to 20, 40, some number of Meebits in exchange for your ETH. You can very easily track what the current market value of this album is. And when it gets wildly above that, something has gone awry. So it has subsequently, the MBBT has come down from about $90 per MBBT to $35 MBBT. It's at a much saner valuation now. But it's just an example, again, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, I think, with Wolfgame, of in these moments of frenzy, people totally lose their head as to what the underlying thing they're buying actually is and what the value of that thing is. So please, please be careful. Use your head. I'm not like a math whiz, but it doesn't take a math whiz to be able to do this basic calculation and see that things were getting out of hand. So As somebody who is sort of partly behind this MVPT project, this is me saying $90 was far too high. But I do think overall, this Seasons album is a really cool concept. It's something that I would love to see other projects emulate or do, which is to offer greater access to true ownership of the underlying assets, not just fractionalized sort of ownership over economic value. Next, I want to talk about Wolfgame, which dominated Twitter for a whole bunch of days right up before Thanksgiving here in the States. So I didn't get to talk about it when it was happening because we didn't do a recap episode that week. But I think this is a fascinating potential case study of where this space could be going. Or maybe it'll be an example of a burst of light that died very quickly. We don't know yet. But it's very much worth tracking so we can see what does happen with Wolfgame. Okay, for somebody who was like under a rock the week of November 21st or whatever and does not know about Wolfgame, here's the basic premise. Wolfgame dropped pretty stealthily and with like a white paper that said, hey, no roadmap, no empty promises. What we're dropping is this game. Here you fucking go, right? And the premise is this. There are sheep and they are in a barn and they are NFTs and they can be sheared for wool, which is an ERC20. The wool is an ERC20 token. That wool can be spent to create new NFTs, mostly sheep, but sometimes wolves. Wolves are outside the barn and they want to steal the sheep and steal the wool. So the farmers on this farm with sheep and wolves have made a deal with the wolves where they say, okay, if you don't come and attack our sheep, we're going to pay you a wool tax. So every time you have a sheep and you shear the sheep for wool, 20% of your wool haul gets paid out to the wolves so that they don't attack you. Okay. Now the way this game actually functionally works is if you have sheep, you can either stake your sheep or not stake your sheep. If you stake your sheep, that's how they earn wool, and they are safe from the wolves. If, however, you unstake your sheep, because, for example, you wanted to sell your sheep on OpenSea, a wolf can come and steal your sheep. And so you may end up with nothing. So it's just like a risk. It's gambling. It's a risk game from that standpoint. Also, every time you use wool to create a new NFT, you can either end up with a sheep or a wolf. You're more likely to end up with a sheep because it's less valuable. And when a new sheep is born through the wool, you're paying your wool, a wolf can come and steal that new sheep that was born. And so again, it's just a game of chance. So this fundamental mechanism, is actually kind of interesting in and of itself because something like this hasn't really been done in the NFT space before, where you have wolf NFTs and sheep NFTs, but the wolf NFTs can steal the sheep NFTs. Like, that concept is new. On the other hand, the concept is very, very basic. You could say this isn't really a game. It's just like rolling dice and seeing what happens. Of course, the thing that makes this so interesting is that because the sheep are NFTs, the wolves are NFTs, and the wool are ERC20 tokens, there's real money to be made off of all of these things. And because the game got popular and it was a novel idea, people were able to make a lot of money selling wool and sheep and wolves. Now, the criticism of this game at the time when it was getting really frothy and big was, okay, but there's no fundamentals here, right? This is all being propped up because people want money, and that's creating this like circular loop where people want money, so they'll play the game, and then more people want the money, and so that drives the price of everything up, and the price being driven up makes more people join, and it becomes this like circular loop. What has happened since 2 weeks ago, when the game was wildly popular, is it's become clear that there's going to be a second phase to this whole thing, where there's presumably a real game that's being built out, where you can use your wool to buy artifacts and decorate your farm. I don't know, I'm speculating as to what this wool will be used for. They did say you could use the wool to buy artifacts. But there's a whole new level to this, is the point, that's going to be launching in 2022. Now, I want to talk about some of the takeaways from this whole thing and why it seemed to get as big as it did. So the on why it got as big as it did, I do think if you read the white papers, there are now 2 white papers, a V1 white paper and a V2 white paper. It's clear the team is very bright and very thoughtful. And they have come up with something that, at least in the NFT space, is truly novel. Again, in the broader world, not very novel. This is a gambling game. But their use of smart contracts to make this happen, very novel. The whole thing is on-chain, which is incredibly impressive. Now, the team itself is anonymous, which I don't love at all. But this is where having a couple key influencers promote the project really helped make this thing as successful as it was. So Beanie, very controversial influencer, has apparently been an advisor to the team. He knows who the team is, though they're anonymous. He has said they mostly come from the DeFi world, which is why you see very DeFi-like protocols being used in this game, the staking mechanisms, etc. And Beanie had several Twitter spaces about this game and talked a lot about it. And I think that tremendously helped to have somebody like that sort of vouching for the team when otherwise the team is anonymous. You also had Gary Vaynerchuk get into this game and get pretty excited about it, which isn't surprising. If you follow Gary Vaynerchuk, you know that Farmville was like a big moment for him, like watching how Farmville played out on Facebook back in 2010 or 2009. He's referenced that several times in the years since as being kind of a watershed moment for him of like, oh my God, look what this like social gaming thing that's going on Facebook. So I'll talk about the Farmville element of this in a minute because I think it's actually really important. But the big names promoting this project was very helpful given that the team was anonymous, but their white paper was honestly quite impressive. But my big takeaways have really been, well, a couple things. On a practical level, when something is super fiery and pumping and every influencer is talking about it, don't buy in. That is not the moment to buy. I know this from personal experience. I've been burned by this before. It's very tempting. I had the temptation moment with Wolfgame when all of this was going down. I really wanted to buy some wool. I wanted to maybe buy some land plots. I debated buying sheep, right? Like I debated all of it. And ultimately my months of training and buying NFT kicked in. And I was like, you've been here before. When everyone else is buying into something, it's almost always at some sort of peak. The project is usually at some sort of peak in that moment. So I held off, I didn't buy. That has paid off because prices have come down significantly. Part of that is because there have been some smart contract challenges. There were some exploits that happened that have totally kind of derailed the original plan, whatever. They seem to be fixing it. But also I think the prices came down because the feverishness of it all did ultimately subside as days passed. So that's not to say this project isn't cool or might not be worth a hell of a lot more in the future. It might, but it's just a word of advice to say if you're in the middle of something and everything's pumping, that's usually a time for you to pump the brakes. Okay. I'm really excited to see what happens with the actual game itself. I say that because, again, this first phase of it where you were shearing sheep and sharing wool and minting new NFTs, whatever, that was just phase 1 to like unleash the broader ecosystem, apparently. And in 2022, we're going to get the actual game, which, again, we're not really sure exactly what that's going to look like. But I think this is going to be a really interesting project to track, to gauge, I don't know, call it the broader viability of play-to-earn games. I know there are lots of people out there who are convinced that play-to-earn is the future, and it probably is, but we don't really know yet. There are also skeptics who are very anti-play-to-earn, and we'll talk about that. And something like this, where you did have this sort of circular mechanic where people were only really in it to make money, feels like a precarious situation. So what I'm curious to see in 2022 is what this game is. And there's sort of 2 pieces to this. A, is the game really fun on its own? Like, would people want to play it if they weren't making money? I think that's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is that if this can be a game that people want to play no matter what, and so the added benefit that you're actually earning money on it is like crazy. So my instinct would be like, that's what you want to do. On the other hand, this is where we pull in Farmville. I think Farmville is a really interesting case study. Farmville was not a fun game. Like, it was hardly a game, right? All it did was like you planted stuff and you had to harvest your crops at particular times of day. And if you missed those times of day, your crops would die and you'd be sad, and it was definitely felt kind of multi-level marketing-y in that you had to bring new friends into the game in order to like earn certain benefits and get, decorate your farm and whatever. Like there was no strategery to this, to Farmville. And yet it was wildly successful. And moreover, there were people who played it for years and years and years and just like enjoyed the methodical feeling of the whole thing. So it'll be really interesting to see if Wolf Game does end up looking a lot more like Farmville, which I think right now there's a good chance that that is what it is, and it does stay successful for many, many years. That's something that's going to be very interesting to understand. And if that happens, I think play to earn, the sky's the limit with play to earn. Because if you have people playing like fairly boring games, but they just love the routine of it and they can make money on that, that's incredibly game-changing for people around the world. So tracking seeing what this game really is going to be in 2022, and then in the long term tracking if it's able to stay successful is going to be very instructive, and I'm very curious. Here's the other piece I want to say on this. There are a lot of people, or I've seen people, I don't know if it's a lot, but I think it is. I've seen people in the gaming community who are very anti-play-to-earn games. And one of the arguments I've seen folks make is that people game because they enjoy it. And it's fun, and it's an escape. And if you add economics to that, if you make somebody's economic livelihood dependent on gaming, this thing they do for fun, then you're going to sort of kill the spirit of why people game in the first place. Now, maybe that sounds like a crazy argument. I actually don't think it is. I think it makes some sense, right? That if you're making money now from the thing that was previously your hobby, it's not really a hobby anymore, and it takes on a whole new shape for you. But what I think that argument misses is that much like NFTs have created a whole new generation of art fans from people who previously didn't care about art, play-to-earn gaming is going to create a new wave of gaming fans from people who weren't previously gamers. So perhaps this is obvious what I'm saying here, but there were a lot of people who got into NFTs because they could make money on it, and now actually care about art and are interested in generative art and artists and this whole world that was historically of no interest to them. And I think gaming will be similar, where you have people like myself, frankly, who have never really been gamers, but see this play to earn thing, see it's a way to make money, see it's changing people's lives internationally, think that's really interesting, and may themselves then end up falling in love with gaming. So I do think that gets missed in the narrative from gamers who are very opposed to play to earn. And the other thing to say is the gaming community hated Farmville too, because they felt like it wasn't really a game for all the reasons I outlined. So certainly there's precedence for gamers being very territorial about what is and is not a game and how it should go, and being wrong from the standpoint that the consumer ultimately decides what is what. So stay tuned. Wolf Game is something I want to track for the long term because I think it'll be very, very instructive to see how this plays out and what that means for the future of play to earn, the gaming space as a whole, the NFT, ERC20 space as a whole. I think this is honestly fascinating.
Everyone is talking about the metaverse these days, and we're all still trying to figure out what it actually is, because everyone is looking for how to get exposure to it. That is why a metaverse index fund is so important, because in such a young market, an index can give you broad exposure to all the various players who are building out all these digital worlds that will ultimately become the metaverse. And that's why you should check out the Metaverse Index from the Index Co-op. The Metaverse Index gives you simple, easy, and safe one-click exposure to the emerging open metaverse trend. The MVI Index contains some of the biggest metaverse projects out there, including Axie Infinity, Decentraland, Illuvium, and more. So join thousands of holders who have already trusted nearly $50 million to the MVI Index. And if you buy $500 of MVI on the Dharma app, you can receive $50 worth of ETH on the Polygon network. There's a link in the show notes for you to click so you can get started on your journey into the metaverse. ONJUNO is your new crypto-enabled financial services company. ONJUNO lets you get your direct deposit paycheck paid to you in crypto. Set up your direct deposit with ONJUNO and receive part of your paycheck in your preferred crypto asset, reducing the time that you're holding on to your inflating dollars. The best thing is ONJUNO sends your crypto directly to your own wallet, whether it's your Ledger, your MetaMask, or however you hold your crypto. ONJUNO can also be a checking account for your crypto, where you manage both your cash and your crypto from one simple account. It's free, and opening up an account with ONJUNO comes with a metal debit card that gives you 5% cash back at select businesses, including Uber, Starbucks, Walmart, Target, and other Web2 companies. Use code BANKLESS when you create your ONJUNO account, and our friends at Juno will airdrop you $50 in ETH when you set up your first crypto paycheck. Sign up at onjuno.com/crypto to get started. That's onjuno.com/crypto.
Okay. Last but not least, we have the Sandbox launching their alpha, right? The first time that the public is getting access to play in the Sandbox. I'm going to give us a little bit of context, a little bit of backstory here. We're going to talk a heck of a lot more about the Sandbox on this podcast because it's such a huge player in the metaverse space at this point. So the Sandbox, and this is really interesting, some folks may know this, the Sandbox actually launched in 2012. This is a very old project. In 2012, it did not have the crypto component to it. It did not have a blockchain component to it. It was simply a place where it was an iOS and I'm sure Android, and it was like an iPhone game where you could build worlds and build games and inhabit those worlds and games. I think sort of a la Roblox. And it's been incredibly popular. It has like 40 million users of the iOS version of the game. So many, many millions of people played the Sandbox long before it had any blockchain affiliation. Then I believe it was 2020, so last year, or maybe it was a couple years back. I believe actually it's more like probably 2017. Once blockchain started to get bigger, Sandbox made the decision to pivot and build out this whole blockchain component, really because so they say, because they wanted the creators, the many people who are creating worlds in the Sandbox, to be able to monetize their creations in ways that have historically never been possible. Again, this is the promise of blockchain, is that creators can suddenly be rewarded for their work in ways that they never have been able to before. So the Sandbox has been a very, very hyped part of the metaverse. There's really like 3 metaverse companies you hear about, like Facebook aside, where you have Decentraland, the Sandbox, and CryptoVoxels. And people have their favorites. The Sandbox is a big deal because, again, they had an existing user base of about 40 million people. They're heavily backed by all sorts of VCs, which is controversial to some folks' minds. And they're really like a Roblox and a Minecraft game, with the added benefit that creators have a lot more control and ownership over the worlds they build, the money they make from selling the assets that they've built, and of course, all of this stuff like the land and the assets can also then be sold on markets outside of the Sandbox, or at least Sand, the main currency in the Sandbox, can be sold outside that. They have all of the like corporate partnerships you could ever want. Atari has a huge chunk of land in the Sandbox. Snoop Dogg is a huge partner of the Sandbox. The Walking Dead has like the IP. The Walking Dead have like these huge plots of land and are building zombie games in the Sandbox. Esports. I mean, they seem to be doing everything right in terms of building out corporate partnerships. But of course, all of this will come down to what is the gameplay experience like in the Sandbox. And really up to this point, we haven't known the answer to that. There hasn't been an answer to that because it's been in beta tests and you've only had very small select groups that have been able to play in it. So alpha, the alpha where you've now the public in the Sandbox is happening right now. It launched on November 29th. So far, the reception seems to be fairly positive. The way this is working is that you have, I think it's 1,000 alpha passes. So you have only 1,000 people who are playing around in its 18 experiences in the Sandbox, like quests and things. But then anybody can come and play in, there's like 3 experiences that they've opened up to anybody in the public. And now with that said, it's only for people who have Windows. I have a Mac. I've not been able to play it. So, this is all to say there is a certain amount of limitations still on who's in the sandbox, but the reception seems to have been positive so far. I've been kind of trolling the internet trying to find reactions from people who have alpha passes who are actually in the game. And all in all, it seems to be like it's living up to its hype, which is a big deal because there's a lot of hype around the sandbox. So again, something to continue to track. We are hopefully going to be talking to one of the members of the executive team of the Sandbox very soon here on this podcast to get much more information on it all. But the Sand token, the token, the currency used in the Sandbox has been pumping like crazy lately, as have all Metaverse tokens because of Facebook's Meta announcement. And it'll be really interesting to see which players can come out on top. I mean, the Sandbox on their roadmap, they want to be a DAO. Eventually, they want to be owned by the community. Apparently, within a certain number of years, all Sand tokens will be owned by the community. So the creators of the Sandbox and their investors apparently are no longer going to hold Sandbox tokens or Sand tokens. So very interesting to see how this plays out. I want to close with this. There was a tweet by Farokh, who's a well-known influencer in this space. This tweet is from a couple weeks ago. And it says, "I don't care what people think, and I don't care if you think I'm too new to have an opinion, but we are never going to enter a multi-year bear market in NFTs ever in this lifetime. Save this and hit me with it if it ever happens, aka never." So he's saying, we'll never have NFTs be down overall for multiple years. They'll always bounce back. This is, this super hot market and will be for our lifetimes. And then G-Money, who's also a somewhat known influencer in the space, replied to this tweet and said, "This might be the biggest top signal I've seen yet." And I want to talk about this because I want to talk about top signals and give you some food for thought to close with as we wrap up the year of 2021, look into the year of 2022, and try and think about what the market might do. I tend to be with G-Money on this, about this being a top signal. A top signal meaning something that's a sign that we've hit the top of the market and that there's more bear news to come. What first popped into my mind when I saw this exchange was the 2008 financial crisis and the fact that we really got into the 2008 financial crisis because most financiers believed that the housing market would just never go down. And so all of these subprime mortgages and the bundles of subprime mortgages that were being bought and sold across all of Wall Street were all predicated on the idea that housing prices would always go up and therefore we wouldn't essentially have a 2008 crisis. And of course, as soon as you think that something can never go down, it goes down. So there were whispers of that mentality here of like NFTs will never go down year over year, which does feel like nearly a guarantee that we're about to enter a 3-year bear market. I'm mostly kidding on that. I also wanted to introduce y'all to the idea of socionomics, which is a concept that I was introduced to right out of college. I worked for a hedge fund, and one of the indicators that this hedge fund looked at as they made investments was social mood. So socionomics is the idea that social mood actually drives the economy. It's a flip of the typical interpretation, which is that like the economy drives social mood. And it says that actually it might be the other way around, that there's sort of general social moods that exist independent of other factors, and that's what ends up driving the economy. So for example, there've been studies, or however you want to phrase this, that show that like massive skyscrapers, like whenever it's like the new tallest building in the world was built, that tends to correspond, or that almost always corresponds with like a peak in the stock market. So there's like this social mood exuberance that's causing people to want to build big buildings. That's also causing them to buy up stocks. And then the social mood flips and it all comes crumbling down. Now, it's really hard to know which comes first, chicken and an egg, the economy or social mood. But the idea itself is really interesting. And I saw an article this past week that it was, I think, from the BBC. Let's see. Yeah, it's the BBC. That said NFT or non-fungible token is Collins Dictionary's word of the year. And this also kind of struck me as a top signal of like just the wild exuberance for NFTs that has happened in 2021. As much as we can all say we are early, and I think in many ways, of course, we are still very early, there has been, the social mood has been quite exuberant when it comes to NFTs and investments this past year. And that does make me worried for what might happen to the market in, call it, the year to come. So I'm very bullish on NFTs. I'm very bullish on blockchain in the long term. I am bracing for what might happen in 2022, though, I have to say. I think 2021 was so big for NFTs and it was so big for investments in general that it does feel like a cooling off is coming. So food for thought. I don't know what y'all think. Would love to hear your thoughts on top signals, on socionomics, on this idea that social mood drives the economy and that certain things then can be seen as sort of top signals, again, like building big buildings. But hopefully you find it interesting and you look a little bit more into it. And with that, I hope you enjoy your weekend. We'll be back next week. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, I would really appreciate if you would leave a rating or a review on the podcast. It helps new listeners find it. And a big shout out to all of you.
Hey, we hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, head over to Bankless HQ right now to develop your crypto investing skills and learn how to free yourself from banks and gain your financial independence. We recommend joining our daily newsletter, podcast, and community as a Bankless Premium subscriber to get the most out of your Bankless experience. You'll get access to our market analysis, our alpha leaks, and exclusive content, and even the Bankless token for airdrops, raffles, and unlocks. If you're interested in crypto, the Bankless community is where you want to be. Click the link in the description to become a Bankless Premium subscriber today. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for in-depth interviews with industry leaders, Ask Me Anythings, and weekly roll-ups where we summarize the week in crypto and other fantastic content. Thanks everyone for watching and being on the journey as we build out the Bankless Nation.